The telegram arrived 3 hours before the wagon carrying her grandmother's body rolled into Eagle Pass, Texas. And Katherine knew immediately that everything she had been running from would now catch up to her in the worst possible way. She stood on the wooden boardwalk outside the general store, clutching the yellow paper in her trembling hands, reading the words over and over as if they might change. Her grandmother, the woman who had raised her since she was 7 years old, was gone. A heart attack, they said. Quick and painless. But Grace felt nothing quick or painless about the grief that crashed through her chest like a freight train. It was April of 1883, and Eagle Pass was experiencing the kind of spring that made men forget their troubles and women hang their laundry with hope. But Grace felt neither forgetfulness nor hope as she watched the undertaker's wagon creak down the dusty main street, pulled by 2 tired mules. She was 21 years old, unmarried, and now completely alone in the world except for the brother she had not seen in 3 years. Her brother Daniel had left Eagle Pass to work on a ranch 2 counties over, chasing dreams of becoming a ranch foreman. He had promised to visit, to write, to stay connected. The letters came less and less frequently until they stopped altogether. Grace tried not to be bitter about it, but standing there watching the wagon that carried the only person who had ever truly loved her, she felt the bitterness rise like bile. The undertaker, a thin man named Mr. Pearson with kind eyes and gentle hands, helped her make the arrangements. Her grandmother would be buried in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the town. Grace had almost no money for a proper funeral, but Mr. Pearson assured her they would make it dignified. That was the word he used, dignified. The day of the funeral was bright and clear, which felt wrong somehow. Grace thought there should be rain, or at least clouds, something to match the darkness she felt inside. But the Texas sky remained stubbornly blue, and the wind carried the scent of wildflowers from the prairie beyond town. Only a handful of people attended. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house where Grace worked, the Reverend Matthews who had known her grandmother from church, a few elderly women who had been in the same quilting circle, and one cowboy Grace did not recognize, standing at the back, hat in his hands, looking respectfully solemn. Grace wore her only black dress, carefully mended at the elbows and let out at the seams because she had grown since she first acquired it 5 years ago. Her grandmother had always been good with a needle, always making their few possessions last as long as possible. The thought made fresh tears spring to Grace's eyes. After the brief service, after they lowered the simple pine coffin into the ground, after the other mourners had expressed their condolences and drifted away, Grace remained. She stood there as the sun climbed higher, as the shadows shortened, as the cemetery keeper waited patiently by the gate. "Miss Kennedy." The voice was deep and gentle, with the slight drawl of someone who had spent their life outdoors. Grace turned to find the cowboy who had stood at the back during the service. He was tall, probably in his mid-20s, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of creek water in summer. His hat was old but well-maintained, his clothes dusty from travel but clean. "I am sorry for your loss." "Thank you," Grace said, her voice rough from crying. "Did you know my grandmother?" "Not well," he admitted. "I met her once when I was passing through about 6 months back. My horse had gone lame, and she was kind enough to offer advice and a cool drink of water. We talked for maybe 20 minutes, but she was one of those people you remember. She mentioned you, said you were working hard, trying to save money, that you had dreams of opening your own dress shop someday." Grace felt her throat tighten. Her grandmother had believed in her dreams even when Grace herself had started to doubt them. "That is kind of you to remember." The cowboy shifted his weight, looking uncertain for a moment before speaking again. "My name is Ryan Xavier. I work at the Double R Ranch about 10 miles north of here. I was in town picking up supplies when I heard about the funeral. I felt I should pay my respects." "That was very thoughtful, Mr. Xavier. Please, just Ryan." He paused, then added, "If you need anything, if there is any way I can help, I am staying at the boarding house tonight before heading back to the ranch tomorrow." Grace nodded, not trusting herself to speak without breaking down completely. Ryan gave a small, respectful nod and walked away, leaving her alone with her grief and the fresh mound of earth that covered her grandmother's grave. The next few days passed in a blur. Grace returned to her work at the boarding house, cooking and cleaning for the residents and transients who stayed there. Mrs. Henderson was kind enough to give her lighter duties, but Grace almost preferred to stay busy. When her hands were occupied, her mind had less time to wander into dark places. It was while sorting through her grandmother's belongings that Grace found the trunk. It had been stored in the tiny room they had shared above the boarding house, pushed into the corner and covered with a quilt. Grace had seen it before but had never thought to ask about its contents. Her grandmother had been a private woman in some ways, and Grace had respected that privacy. Now, kneeling on the worn wooden floor, Grace opened the trunk with trembling hands. Inside, wrapped carefully in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, was a dress. A wedding dress. Grace lifted it out slowly, reverently, and held it up to the lamplight. It was beautiful despite its age and condition. Made of ivory satin that had faded slightly to cream, with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, tiny pearl buttons down the back, and a full skirt that would have swept the floor when worn. But it was also damaged. A long tear ran from the hem up nearly to the waist on one side, the edges frayed and stained. Another smaller tear marked the bodice near the left shoulder. Grace pressed the dress to her chest and sank onto her grandmother's narrow bed. She had never known much about her grandmother's marriage. The grandfather she had never met had died young, before Grace was even born. Her grandmother rarely spoke of him, and when she did, there was a distant look in her eyes that suggested both love and pain. Beneath the dress in the trunk, Grace found a small bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, a daguerreotype of a serious-looking young man in a suit, and a journal with a worn leather cover. Grace knew she should probably not read the journal, that it contained private thoughts never meant for her eyes. But she was desperate to feel connected to her grandmother in some way, to understand the woman who had shaped her life. The journal entries were sporadic, sometimes months or even years between them. But as Grace read by lamplight, a story emerged. Her grandmother had married at 18 to a man she loved deeply. They had been happy, scraping together a life on a small homestead in East Texas. But her husband had been killed in an accident just 2 years into their marriage, crushed when a barn beam fell during a storm. Her grandmother had been wearing her wedding dress that day, planning to surprise her husband with an anniversary dinner. She had been in the barn helping him when the storm hit, when the old structure began to collapse. She had survived with only cuts and bruises. He had not survived at all. Grace found herself crying again, but this time not just for her own loss, but for the young woman her grandmother had been, wearing her beautiful wedding dress and watching her husband die. The dress had torn as she tried to pull him free from the debris. It had stained with his blood and the mud of the barn floor, and her grandmother had kept it all these years, unable to repair it, unable to throw it away, a symbol of both the greatest love and the greatest loss of her life. Grace carefully folded the dress and placed it back in the trunk. She would keep it safe, she decided. It was all she had left of her grandmother's history, of the love that had shaped her grandmother into the strong, kind woman who had raised her. The next morning, Mrs. Henderson knocked on Grace's door with news. "There is a gentleman here to see you, dear." That cowboy from the funeral, Ryan Xavier. Grace quickly smoothed her hair and her apron, wondering what he could possibly want. She found him waiting in the boarding house parlor, hat in hands again, looking slightly nervous. "Miss Kennedy," he said when she entered, "I hope I am not intruding." "Not at all. Please call me Grace." "Grace," he repeated, and something about the way he said her name made her heart skip slightly. "I wanted to check on you to see if you needed anything before I head back to the ranch." "That is very kind, but I am managing." Ryan nodded but did not leave. He seemed to be working up the courage to say something else. Finally, he cleared his throat and said, "I also wanted to ask if perhaps you might like to take a walk. Just around town, nothing improper. But I thought you might appreciate some fresh air and company. Grieving alone is hard." "I know from experience." Grace hesitated. It was forward of him to ask, and she barely knew him. But something in his eyes, a genuine kindness and a shadow of his own past pain, made her trust him. "I would like that, actually." They walked through Eagle Pass in the late morning sunshine, down streets Grace had known all her life, but which somehow seemed different with Ryan beside her. He told her about growing up in Oklahoma Territory, about losing his own mother when he was 16, about drifting for a few years before finding steady work at the Double R Ranch. "The foreman there, man named Charlie Sutton, he gave me a chance when a lot of places would not," Ryan explained as they walked along the creek that ran behind the main street. "Saw past the rough edges and the anger I was carrying and put me to work. Been there 3 years now. It is a good life, hard but honest." "Do you ever think about doing something else?" Grace asked. "Sometimes. I have thought about saving enough to start my own small spread someday, just a few head of cattle and some horses. Nothing big, but something that would be mine." He glanced at her. "What about you? Your grandmother mentioned you wanted to open a dress shop." Grace smiled sadly. "That seems like a foolish dream now. I have been saving what I can from my wages, but it is not much. And now with her gone, I am not sure what I will do. I cannot afford to keep the room on my own. Mrs. Henderson has been kind, but she runs a business." "That is a hard situation," Ryan said sympathetically. "But do not give up on your dreams just yet. Sometimes when one door closes, another opens. You just have to keep your eyes open for it." They talked for over an hour, and Grace felt something in her chest loosen, the tight knot of grief relaxing just slightly. Ryan was easy to talk to, and he listened in a way that made her feel truly heard. When he finally said he needed to get back to the ranch, Grace felt a pang of disappointment. "May I visit again?" he asked as they stood outside the boarding house. "Next time I am in town." "I would like that," Grace said, and meant it. Ryan returned 2 weeks later and then again 2 weeks after that. Each visit lasted longer than the last. They would walk together, talking about everything and nothing. Ryan told her stories about ranch life, about ornery cattle and wild horses, about sleeping under the stars and cooking over campfires. Grace told him about her dreams, about the dress designs she sketched in a small notebook, about her hope to someday create beautiful things for women to wear on the most important days of their lives. "Like wedding dresses?" Ryan asked during one of these conversations. "Especially wedding dresses," Grace confirmed. "There is something special about them, something about helping a woman feel beautiful on the day she commits her life to someone else." Summer arrived in full force, bringing heat that shimmered off the dusty streets and made everyone move a little slower. Ryan's visits became more frequent. He would arrange his trips to town to coincide with Grace's half-days off, and they would spend hours together. Grace found herself watching for him, her heart lifting whenever she saw him ride down the main street on his dependable bay gelding. Mrs. Henderson noticed, of course. "That young cowboy is quite taken with you," she said to Grace one evening as they prepared dinner for the boarders. "We are just friends," Grace protested, but she felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Friends," Mrs. Henderson repeated with a knowing smile. "Well, he seems like a good man, steady, respectful. Those are qualities worth their weight in gold." Grace could not argue with that. Ryan was good and steady and respectful. He was also handsome and funny and made her feel things she had never felt before, things that both excited and frightened her. It was late July when Ryan arrived in town looking troubled. Grace could see it in the set of his shoulders, in the way his usual easy smile was forced. They walked to their usual spot by the creek, and she waited for him to speak. "The Double R is having financial troubles," Ryan finally said. "The owner's been making poor decisions, gambling more than he should. There is talk he might have to sell, or at least let some of the hands go. I might be out of work by the end of summer." "Oh, Ryan, I am so sorry." Grace laid her hand on his arm without thinking. "What will you do?" "I have been saving. I could probably find work at another ranch, but it would mean leaving the area." He looked at her, and Grace saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "I do not want to leave, Grace. Not now. Not when I have found something here worth staying for." They stood there by the creek, the water burbling softly over stones, cicadas singing in the cottonwood trees. Grace's heart was pounding so hard she was sure Ryan must be able to hear it. "What have you found here?" she whispered, though she thought she knew the answer. "You," Ryan said simply. He took both her hands in his calloused palms warm and solid. "I know we have not known each other long, and I know I do not have much to offer right now. But Grace, I have fallen in love with you. I think I started falling that first day at the funeral, watching you stand there so brave and heartbroken, and I have just kept falling every day since." Tears sprang to Grace's eyes, but they were not tears of grief this time. "I love you too," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I was so afraid you would leave, and I would never see you again." Ryan pulled her into his arms, and Grace rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other in the summer heat, the future uncertain but the feeling between them solid and real. "I want to marry you," Ryan said softly. "I want to build a life with you, whatever that looks like. I know the timing is not ideal, and I cannot give you the wedding you deserve right now, but I promise I will spend the rest of my life trying to make you happy." Grace pulled back to look up at him, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "I do not need a fancy wedding, Ryan. I just need you." "Are you sure?" Every woman dreams of a beautiful wedding dress and a big celebration. Grace thought of her grandmother's torn wedding dress, stored carefully in the trunk in her room. She thought of the love that dress represented, a love so strong it had sustained her grandmother through decades of widowhood, through raising an orphaned granddaughter, through all the hardships life had thrown at her. "A wedding is just one day," Grace said. "A marriage is a lifetime. I would rather have a lifetime with you than the fanciest wedding in Texas." Ryan kissed her then, sweet and gentle and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling despite the tears in their eyes. "We should probably tell Mrs. Henderson," Grace said with a shaky laugh. "And we need to make plans. Where will we live? What will we do for money?" "One step at a time," Ryan said. "First, let me talk to the foreman at the ranch, see if there are any updates on the situation, and I will start asking around about other work just in case. We will figure it out, Grace." Together, over the next few weeks, they began to plan. Ryan did indeed lose his job when the Double R Ranch was sold to settle the owner's gambling debts, but he quickly found work at a smaller spread called the Lazy K, about 15 miles from Eagle Pass. The pay was not as good, but it was steady. Grace continued her work at the boarding house and began taking in sewing on the side, mending clothes and altering dresses for the women in town. Every penny they earned was carefully saved. They decided to marry in September, after the worst of the summer heat had passed. It would be a simple ceremony at the church with just a few witnesses. Grace tried not to think too much about the fact that she had no family to attend, that her brother Daniel had not responded to the letter she sent telling him about their grandmother's death or her upcoming marriage. "You have me now," Ryan told her when he found her crying over it one evening. "And someday, God willing, we will have children, and they will have aunts and uncles and cousins. We will build our own family, Grace." A week before the wedding, Grace made a decision. She pulled out her grandmother's trunk and carefully removed the torn wedding dress. She spread it across her bed and studied it in the lamplight, thinking about the young bride who had worn it, about the love and loss it represented. The dress would not fit her as it was. Her grandmother had been shorter and more slightly built. But Grace had skills with a needle, skills her grandmother had taught her. She could alter it, repair what could be repaired, work around the tiers that were too damaged to fix. For 3 days, Grace worked on the dress whenever she had a spare moment. She carefully unpicked seams and took in the bodice to fit her frame. She lengthened the skirt using lace and fabric from an old petticoat she had been saving. The tier on the bodice she covered with a delicate overlay of lace that had belonged to one of her grandmother's doilies. The long tier on the skirt she could not fully hide, but she reinforced the edges and turned it into a design element, adding ribbons and more lace to make it look intentional. When she finally tried on the completed dress the night before the wedding, standing in front of the small mirror in her room, Grace barely recognized herself. The ivory satin glowed in the lamplight. The lace overlay gave the dress an ethereal quality. And yes, you could still see evidence of the tears if you looked closely, still see the faint stains that decades of careful cleaning had not fully removed. But somehow that made the dress more beautiful, not less. It was a dress with a history, with a story, with love woven into every thread. Mrs. Henderson knocked on the door and entered without waiting for an answer. She stopped short when she saw Grace. "Oh, my dear girl," she breathed. "That dress. Where did you get it?" "It was my grandmother's," Grace said, running her hands over the satin skirt. "She wore it when she married my grandfather. It was damaged, but I repaired it as best I could." "It is perfect," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "Absolutely perfect." The wedding day dawned clear and bright. Grace woke early, her stomach fluttering with nervous excitement. Mrs. Henderson helped her dress, carefully fastening the tiny pearl buttons and arranging the lace. Grace pinned up her hair in the simple style she favored and tucked a small sprig of wildflowers behind her ear. The ceremony was set for 10 in the morning to avoid the worst of the day's heat. Grace walked to the church alone, carrying a small bouquet of sunflowers that Mrs. Henderson had picked from her garden. As she approached the white clapboard building, she saw Ryan waiting on the steps, wearing a new white shirt and his best pants, his hair still damp from washing. When Ryan saw her, his expression transformed. He walked toward her as if drawn by an invisible string, his eyes wide with wonder. "Grace," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "That dress. You look like an angel." Grace felt self-conscious suddenly, aware of the visible tears in the fabric, the stains that could not be removed, the patchwork of lace and ribbon she had used to make the repairs. "It is not perfect," she began. "It was my grandmother's, but it was damaged. I tried to fix it, but you can still see where it was torn." Ryan shook his head, reaching out to take her free hand. "It is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen," he said with complete sincerity. "Not despite the tears, but because of them. That dress has a story. It survived something. Just like you have. Just like we will, whatever comes." Tears sprang to Grace's eyes, threatening to ruin the composure she had been trying to maintain. "You really think so?" "I know so." Ryan lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "You are the most beautiful bride in the world, Grace Kennedy. And in a few minutes, you will be Grace Xavier, and I will be the luckiest man alive." They entered the church together, hand in hand. Reverend Matthews was waiting for them, along with Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Pearson the undertaker, who had agreed to stand as witnesses. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. Grace's voice shook only slightly as she repeated her vows, promising to love and honor Ryan for all the days of her life. Ryan's voice was steady and strong, his eyes never leaving hers as he made the same promises. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, Ryan kissed Grace sweetly, tenderly, as if she were something precious and fragile that might break. The small group clapped and Mrs. Henderson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. After the ceremony, Mrs. Henderson had prepared a small wedding breakfast at the boarding house. There was ham and fresh bread, scrambled eggs and coffee, and a small cake she had baked herself. It was simple fare, but it tasted like the finest feast to Grace, who sat beside her new husband and felt happiness bloom in her chest like the wildflowers on the prairie. "What will you do now?" Mr. Pearson asked as they ate. "Where will you live?" "The Lazy K has a line shack that the foreman said we could fix up," Ryan explained. "It is not much, just one room really, but it is weathertight and comes with the job. We will live there while we save for something better." "And I will continue taking and sewing," Grace added. "Eventually, I still hope to open a dress shop, but that can wait. Right now, I just want to build a life with my husband." The word felt strange and wonderful on her tongue. Husband. Ryan was her husband. She was his wife. They were a family now, just the two of them, starting their life together with nothing but love and determination and hope. That afternoon, Ryan borrowed a wagon from the livery stable, and they loaded Grace's few possessions into the back. The trunk containing her grandmother's things went in first, carefully wrapped in blankets. Her sewing supplies, her clothes, her few books. It all fit easily into the small wagon, which made Grace feel both sad and liberated. Everything she owned in the world, and it barely filled a wagon bed. The ride to the Lazy K took about 2 hours. Ryan kept one arm around Grace as he drove, and she leaned into him, watching the landscape roll by. The land here was flatter than the hills around Eagle Pass, covered in golden grass that rippled in the wind like waves on an ocean. Cattle grazed in the distance, and hawks circled overhead looking for prey. The line shack was indeed small, but Grace fell in love with it immediately. It sat in a small hollow, protected from the worst winds by a grove of mesquite trees. The single room had a fireplace, a narrow bed, a small table with 2 chairs, and some rough shelves on the wall. There was a pump outside for water and an outhouse a respectable distance away. "I know it is not much," Ryan said, looking uncertain as Grace explored their new home. "But I promise it is just temporary. We will save money and someday we will have a real house with multiple rooms and a proper kitchen." "Ryan," Grace said, turning to face him, "it is perfect. It is ours. That makes it perfect." They spent the rest of the day settling in, hanging Grace's few dresses on pegs by the door, arranging her sewing supplies on one of the shelves, storing food in the small cupboard Ryan had built. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Ryan lit a fire in the fireplace and they sat together on the narrow bed, holding hands and watching the flames dance. "Are you happy?" Ryan asked softly. "Happier than I have ever been," Grace answered truthfully. And she was. Despite the grief that still ached in her chest when she thought of her grandmother, Despite the uncertainty of their financial future, despite the simplicity of their circumstances, she was truly happy. She had married a good man who loved her, and she loved him in return. They had a roof over their heads and food to eat and each other. What more did they really need? That night, as they lay together in the narrow bed, Ryan whispered promises into Grace's hair. Promises of love and loyalty, of working hard and building a future, of children someday and a home full of laughter. Grace held him close and made her own silent promises, to be a good wife, to support his dreams as he supported hers, to love him with the same fierce devotion her grandmother had loved her grandfather. The months that followed were not easy, but they were good. Ryan worked long days at the Lazy K, herding cattle, mending fences, breaking horses. He would come home exhausted and saddle sore, but he always had a smile for Grace, always made time to sit with her in the evening and talk about their days. Grace transformed their simple lined shack into a home. She made curtains from flour sacks, braided a rug for the floor, planted wildflowers around the doorstep. She took in sewing from the ranch wives and the women in Eagle Pass, and her skill with a needle became well known. Women began seeking her out specifically, willing to pay good money for her careful work. One evening in late November, about 3 months after their wedding, Grace was working on altering a dress for the rancher's wife when Ryan came home looking excited. "I have news," he said, his eyes bright. Grace set down her sewing. "Good news, I hope. The foreman is retiring next spring. He recommended me to take his place. The owner wants to talk to me about it tomorrow, but Charlie says the job is mine if I want it. It comes with better pay and a real house with 3 rooms. Grace jumped up and threw her arms around him. "Ryan, that is wonderful. You deserve this. You have worked so hard." "We have worked hard," Ryan corrected, holding her tight. "This is our success, Grace, yours and mine together." Ryan did indeed become the new foreman of the Lazy K, effective in March of 1884. The small house that came with the position was not fancy, but to Grace it felt like a mansion after the lined shack. It had a bedroom, a kitchen with an actual cook stove, and a front room for sitting. There was even a small covered porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sun set over the prairie. Grace set up her sewing corner in the front room, by the window where the light was best. Her business continued to grow. Women came from as far as 20 miles away to have her make or alter their dresses. She was especially sought after for wedding dresses. Word had spread about her own wedding dress, about how she had transformed something damaged into something beautiful, and brides wanted that same magic for themselves. Grace found deep satisfaction in this work. Each dress she made or repaired was a small piece of art, a tangible way to help women feel beautiful and special on important days. She thought of her grandmother often as she worked, thankful for the skills she had learned, for the example of strength and resilience she had been given. In June of that year, Grace realized her monthly courses were late. She waited another 2 weeks, afraid to hope, before finally allowing herself to believe what her body was telling her. She was with child. She and Ryan were going to have a baby. She told him that evening as they sat on the porch after supper. Ryan was so overwhelmed he could not speak for a moment. Then he pulled her into his arms and held her so tight she could barely breathe, and she felt his tears wet against her neck. "We are going to be parents," he finally managed to say. "Grace, we are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Grace asked, though she could feel the answer in the way he held her. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Ryan said. "I am terrified and thrilled and so grateful I can barely stand it. You have given me everything, Grace. A home, a purpose, and now a child. I do not know what I did to deserve you, but I thank God for you every single day." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and fall. Grace continued her sewing work, making a careful collection of tiny gowns and blankets for the baby. Ryan became almost comically protective, always worrying about her overdoing things, insisting she rest even when she felt perfectly fine. "I am growing a baby, not dying of consumption," Grace told him with exasperated affection after he insisted for the third time in one day that she sit down. "I know, but I cannot help worrying," Ryan admitted. "You and this baby are my whole world, Grace. I could not bear it if something happened to either of you." Grace softened at that, understanding that his worry came from love. She took his hand and placed it on her swollen belly, smiling when the baby kicked against his palm. "We are both fine, strong and healthy. But I promise I will be careful." The baby came in February of 1885, during a cold snap that froze the water in the pump and left frost patterns on the windows. Grace's labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Ryan rode hard to fetch the midwife from the main ranch house, a capable woman named Mrs. Garcia, who had delivered dozens of babies. Mrs. Garcia was calm and efficient, guiding Grace through the pain, knowing exactly when to encourage and when to let her rest. Ryan stayed by Grace's side the whole time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth, murmuring encouragement even when she was too far gone in pain to really hear him. Finally, just as the sun was setting on the second day, their son was born. He came into the world squalling and red-faced, healthy and strong. Mrs. Garcia cleaned him and wrapped him in one of the blankets Grace had made, then placed him in Grace's arms. "A boy," Grace said wonderingly, looking down at the tiny face, the shock of dark hair, the impossibly small fingers that curled around hers. "Ryan, we have a son." Ryan was crying openly, unashamed of the tears that ran down his weathered cheeks. He touched the baby's head with a gentle hand, his expression full of such love and wonder that Grace felt her own tears start again. "What should we name him?" Ryan asked. Grace had thought about this through the long months of pregnancy. "I would like to name him after my grandfather, if that is all right with you. Henry James Xavier." "Henry," Ryan repeated, testing the name. "It is perfect. He is perfect. You are perfect." He leaned down and kissed Grace's forehead, then gently kissed the baby's downy head. "Thank you for this gift, Grace. Thank you for him, for us, for everything." The days after Henry's birth were exhausting but full of joy. Grace had never known she could feel such overwhelming love, such fierce protectiveness as she felt for her son. Ryan was a devoted father from the start, changing nappies without complaint, walking the floor with Henry during fussy nights, singing off-key lullabies that somehow always soothed the baby. When Henry was 6 weeks old, Grace bundled him carefully and rode with Ryan into Eagle Pass for supplies. They stopped at the boarding house to visit Mrs. Henderson, who cooed over the baby and declared him the most handsome child she had ever seen. "You two have done well for yourselves," Mrs. Henderson said as they sat in her parlor drinking tea. "A good marriage, a beautiful child, steady work. Your grandmother would be so proud of you, Grace." Grace felt the familiar ache of grief, softened now by time but never fully gone. "I wish she could have met him." "I believe she can see him," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "I believe she is watching over all of you, smiling at the life you have built." Grace liked to think that was true. She liked to imagine her grandmother looking down, seeing Grace in her role as wife and mother, seeing the dress shop dreams that still simmered on the back burner, seeing the love that filled her life. As Henry grew from infant to toddler, life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Ryan continued as foreman of the Lazy K, well respected by the owner and the other ranch hands. Grace's sewing business thrived, and she began to save money again, carefully tucking away coins and bills in a jar hidden in the back of a cupboard. Her dream of opening a dress shop had not died, only waited patiently for the right time. When Henry was 2 years old, Grace discovered she was pregnant again. This time the news felt less terrifying and more like a natural next step. They were more settled now, more confident in their roles as parents. The house felt like it had room for another child, another soul to love and nurture. Their daughter was born in December of 1887, an easier birth than Henry's had been. They named her Ryan Xavier, and she was as different from her brother as night from day. Where Henry had been loud and active even as an infant, Rose was calm and observant, watching the world with serious dark eyes. Grace sometimes felt overwhelmed by the demands of caring for two small children while maintaining her sewing business, but Ryan was always there to support her. He would take the children outside to give her quiet time to work, or he would help with the cooking and cleaning without being asked. They were true partners in every sense, building their life together one day at a time. One evening in the spring of 1888, after the children were asleep, Ryan sat down with Grace at the kitchen table with a serious expression. "I have something to discuss with you." Grace set down the dress she had been hemming, giving him her full attention. "What is it? The owner of the Lazy K is getting old. He has been talking about retiring, maybe selling the ranch. He approached me today with an offer. He wants to sell me 100 acres on the eastern edge of the property, the land where our house sits plus enough to run a small herd. He would give me a very good price. Let me pay it off over time." Grace's heart began to beat faster. That would make us landowners. We would have our own place. "It would be a risk," Ryan cautioned. "We would be responsible for our own herd, our own income. No more steady foreman wages. And we would have debt at least until we paid off the land." "But it would be ours," Grace said slowly, thinking it through. "Our own land, our own cattle, our own future to build however we want." "There is more," Ryan said. He took her hand across the table. "The eastern 100 acres borders the road into Eagle Pass. That strip of land near the road, it would be perfect for a building. A shop, maybe. If someone wanted to open a business there, they would get traffic from people heading into town." Grace understood what he was saying, what he was offering. "My dress shop." "Your dress shop," Ryan confirmed. "If we buy this land, if we make this work, we could build you that shop you have dreamed about. It might take a few years, but we could do it, Grace. We could make all our dreams come true." Grace thought about her grandmother, about the dreams deferred and the love that had sustained her through loss. She thought about the torn wedding dress she still kept carefully stored, about how something damaged could become something beautiful with patience and care and love. She thought about her children sleeping in the next room, about the life she and Ryan had built from nothing but hope and hard work. "Yes," she said firmly. "Let us do it. Let us buy the land and build our future." The next few years were the hardest of Grace's life, but also the most rewarding. They bought the land, taking on debt that sometimes kept Grace awake at night worrying. Ryan worked from before dawn until after dark, building their herd, improving the property, doing everything possible to make their small ranch successful. Grace continued her sewing work, the income from it now essential to their survival, and she cared for the children and the house and the large garden she planted to help feed them. There were setbacks and disappointments. A harsh winter in 1889 killed several of their cattle. A dry summer in 1890 withered the grass and forced Ryan to sell stock at a loss. But there were also triumphs. A particularly good calf crop, a rainstorm that came at just the right time to save the grazing, an especially lucrative sewing commission that allowed Grace to buy a better sewing machine. Through it all, their love for each other only deepened. They learned to communicate without words, each knowing what the other needed with just a look. They learned to lean on each other in hard times and celebrate together in good times. They learned that a marriage was not just about the romantic moments, but about the everyday choice to show up, to work hard, to be patient and kind and loyal even when things were difficult. By 1892, they had paid off half the debt on the land. Grace's sewing business had grown so much that women were coming from 3 counties away, and she had a waiting list of orders. Ryan's herd had grown to nearly 200 head, and he had hired 2 ranch hands to help with the work. Their children were thriving, Henry now 7 years old and already helping his father with small ranch chores, Rose 5 and showing early signs of her mother's talent with a needle. One evening in June, Ryan came home with an announcement. "I think it is time." "Time for what?" Grace asked, though her heart had already guessed. "Time to build your dress shop." Grace felt tears spring to her eyes. After so many years of dreaming, of working and saving and hoping, it was finally going to happen. "Are you sure? Can we afford it? We have been saving. We have the land." "And honestly, Grace, you need a proper space. You have outgrown the front room. Women are constantly coming to the house for fittings, and as the children get older, it is becoming more disruptive. A separate shop would solve all of that, plus it would allow you to expand even more." They began planning immediately. The shop would be modest, just one large room with good windows for light and a small storeroom in back. They would build it from wood, simple but sturdy. Ryan and his ranch hands would do most of the construction work themselves to save money. All through that summer, Grace watched her dreams slowly take shape. The foundation went in first, then the frame, then the walls and roof. She spent hours standing at the construction site, holding Rose's hand and watching the men work, hardly believing it was real. The shop was finished by October, just before the weather turned cold. Grace spent weeks setting it up exactly as she wanted. She hung curtains in the windows for privacy during fittings. She arranged her sewing machine and cutting table to catch the best light. She installed shelves for fabric and notions, a mirror for customers to see themselves, a comfortable chair where women could sit during consultations. The sign Ryan had commissioned arrived a week before the grand opening. It was simple but elegant, painted white with dark green lettering that read "Grace's Dress Shop," with "Specializing in Wedding Gowns" in smaller letters below. The grand opening was on a Saturday in November. Grace had placed advertisements in the Eagle Pass newspaper and spread word through all her existing customers. She was terrified no one would come, that all this work and investment would be for nothing. She need not have worried. Women began arriving before she had even officially opened, and they kept coming all day. Some were existing customers coming to see the new space. Others were curious newcomers who had heard about Grace's skills. Several were young women beginning to plan weddings, hoping for appointments to discuss dress designs. By the end of that first day, Grace had more orders than she could fill in the next 3 months. She stood in her shop as the last customer left, looking around at the space she had dreamed of for so long, and felt a sense of accomplishment so profound it brought tears to her eyes. Ryan came to walk her home, having watched the children all day. He looked around the shop with obvious pride. "You did it, Grace. You really did it." "We did it," Grace corrected, echoing words he had said to her years ago. "This is your success too, Ryan. You believed in me when I barely believed in myself. You worked to make this possible. This is ours." That night, after the children were asleep, they sat together on their porch as they had so many times before. The November air was crisp and cool, and stars spread across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. You ever think about that day at your grandmother's funeral? Ryan asked. About how we met. All the time, Grace admitted. I was so lost that day, so alone and scared. And then you were there, this kind stranger who stayed for the whole service even though you barely knew her. I think some part of me recognized you even then, recognized that you were going to be important to me. I saw you standing there in your mended black dress, so brave and so sad, and something in my chest just cracked open, Ryan said. I knew I had to know you, had to be part of your life somehow. And then when I came to check on you when we started talking, I started falling and I never stopped. I never stopped either, Grace said softly. She thought about her grandmother's wedding dress, still carefully preserved in its trunk. She thought about the tears that could not be hidden, the damage that had become part of its beauty. Do you remember what you said when you saw me in my wedding dress? My grandmother's torn dress that I had tried to repair. I said it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, Ryan answered. And I meant it, Grace. I still mean it. That dress represented everything you are, strong enough to take something damaged and make it beautiful, brave enough to honor the past while building a future, creative enough to see possibilities where others might see only loss. Grace leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling contentment settle over her like a warm blanket. They had come so far from that day at the funeral, from the uncertain young woman and the drifting cowboy who had found each other in the midst of grief. They had built a life together that was better than anything either of them could have imagined alone. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. The dress shop thrived, becoming known throughout South Texas for the quality of Grace's work. She hired 2 young women to help with the simpler sewing, teaching them as her grandmother had once taught her. She became particularly sought after for wedding dresses, and she poured her heart into each one, creating beautiful gowns that made brides feel special on their important day. The ranch also prospered under Ryan's management. He proved to have a gift for breeding cattle, and his stock became known for quality. He expanded gradually, buying additional land when he could afford it, always careful never to overextend. By the late 1890s, the Xavier Ranch was one of the most respected small operations in the area. Henry grew into a tall, serious young man who loved ranch life as much as his father did. From the time he was 12, there was never any question that he would take over the ranch someday. He had Ryan's steady nature and Grace's determination, and he worked hard to learn everything Ryan could teach him about cattle and horses and land management. Rose, on the other hand, showed no interest in ranch work, but took to sewing like she had been born with a needle in her hand. From a young age, she would sit in the dress shop watching her mother work, and by the time she was 10, she was creating her own designs. Grace recognized the same passion in her daughter that she herself felt, and she carefully nurtured it. In 1898, when Grace was 36 and Ryan was 40, they welcomed a surprise 3rd child, another son they named William Thomas. His arrival, unexpected after 11 years with no other children, felt like a gift. Henry was 13 and Rose 11, both old enough to help care for their baby brother, and the whole family doted on him. As the new century approached, Grace sometimes found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. She thought about that grief-stricken 21-year-old girl, standing alone at her grandmother's graveside with no idea what her future held. She thought about the torn wedding dress and the cowboy who had seen beauty in the damage. She thought about all the choices, large and small, that had led her to this life. One afternoon in the spring of 1900, an older woman came into the dress shop. Grace was helping another customer, so Rose, now 16 and working regularly in the shop, greeted the newcomer. "May I help you?" Rose asked politely. "I am looking for Grace Kennedy," the woman said. "Or I suppose she might go by a different name now if she married." Grace looked up from the wedding dress she had been pinning and felt her heart skip. The woman looked vaguely familiar, something about the shape of her face, the color of her eyes. "I am Grace Xavier, formerly Kennedy. How may I help you?" The woman's face lit up. "Grace, oh my dear, you probably do not remember me. I am your Aunt Sarah, your father's sister. We met a few times when you were very young, before your parents died." Grace felt like the floor had tilted beneath her feet. She had thought all of her father's family had cut ties after her parents' deaths, had wanted nothing to do with an orphaned niece. Aunt Sarah. "But I thought everyone had forgotten about me." "Never forgotten," Sarah said, her eyes filling with tears. "But we were in New York, so far away, and we did not have the means to take you in. Your grandmother wrote to us occasionally, letting us know you were well. And then the letters stopped, and we feared the worst. It took me this long to save enough money for the train fare to come looking for you." Grace felt a complicated swirl of emotions. Anger that this aunt had not been there when she needed family most. Hurt that years had passed with no contact. But also a tentative hope, a possibility of connection to her lost past. "My grandmother passed away in 1883. I should have written to let you know, but honestly I did not think anyone would care." "We cared," Sarah said firmly. "We have always cared. Please, can we talk? I want to hear about your life, to know the woman you have become." Grace sent Rose to the house to fetch Ryan, knowing she needed his steady presence for this conversation. They closed the shop early and went home, where Sarah met Ryan and the children and heard the whole story of Grace's life since her grandmother's death. In return, Sarah told stories about Grace's father as a young man, about the parents Grace barely remembered. She pulled out a small photograph she had carried with her, a picture of Grace's mother and father on their wedding day. Grace held it carefully, studying the faces, seeing familiar features in her own reflection. "They loved you so much," Sarah said. "Your mother especially was so excited to be a mother. She used to write me letters full of stories about things you said and did. I am sorry you lost them so young, Grace, and I am sorry we were not there for you when you needed us." "You are here now," Grace said, and meant it. The anger and hurt were fading, replaced by gratitude for this unexpected connection to her past. That matters. Sarah stayed for 2 weeks, getting to know Grace's family. She fell in love with the children, with Ryan's quiet strength, with the life Grace had built. On her last evening, as they all sat together on the porch after dinner, Sarah turned to Grace with tears in her eyes. "I came here hoping to find you alive and well," she said. "But I found so much more than that. I found a strong, accomplished woman with a beautiful family and a thriving business. Your parents would be so proud. Your grandmother would be so proud. I am proud." After Sarah left to return to New York, promising to write regularly and visit again when she could, Grace felt like a missing piece of her life had clicked into place. She had family again, not just the family she had created with Ryan, but family that connected her to her roots, to where she had come from. The dress shop continued to grow. In 1902, Grace expanded, adding a second room to handle the increased business. Rose was now working full-time alongside her mother, and they made an excellent team. Rose had a natural eye for design that complemented Grace's technical skills perfectly. One day, in early 1903, a young bride came in for her final fitting. As Grace made the last small adjustments to the beautiful white satin gown, the girl said, "My mother was married in a dress you made. She has told me the story 100 times about how you made her feel like the most beautiful bride in the world. I knew I wanted you to make my dress too." "Who is your mother?" Grace asked. "Emily Carson." "Well, Emily Sutton now." Grace felt a warm glow of pride. She remembered Emily Carson, a shy young woman who had come to her nearly 15 years ago for her wedding dress. Grace had spent hours with her, coaxing out her preferences, helping her overcome her self-consciousness. The idea that Emily had remembered, had spoken of it to her daughter, that the torch was being passed to the next generation, filled Grace with deep satisfaction. This became more common as the years passed. Women who had worn Grace's dresses for their weddings brought their daughters to her. Grace became known not just for her skill, but for the way she made every bride feel special, for the care and attention she put into every gown. The torn wedding dress that had started it all, her grandmother's dress that she had worn to marry Ryan, became almost legendary. Women would ask to see it, to hear the story, and Grace would carefully unfold it, showing how damage could be transformed into beauty. In 1905, Henry married a rancher's daughter named Katherine, a sensible young woman who loved ranch life as much as he did. Rose made her sister-in-law's wedding dress, an elegant creation that rivaled anything Grace herself could have made. The wedding was a joyful affair, attended by seemingly everyone in the county. Grace stood beside Ryan and watched their eldest son pledge his life to his bride, and she felt the circle of life continuing. Henry and Katherine settled in a small house on the ranch property, and Henry gradually took over more and more of the ranch management. Ryan, now in his 50s and starting to feel the effects of decades of hard physical labor, was happy to let his son shoulder more of the responsibility. 2 years later, Rose met a young man named Peter Jameson, a schoolteacher who had come to Eagle Pass from Dallas. He was educated and kind, with a love for books and learning that complemented Rose's artistic nature. They courted for a year before Peter asked for her hand in marriage, and of course, Rose designed and made her own wedding dress, a stunning creation that left everyone breathless. The wedding took place on a perfect spring day in 1908. As Grace watched her daughter marry her gentle schoolteacher, she thought about her own wedding 25 years earlier, about standing in front of the church in her grandmother's repaired dress and feeling like the luckiest woman alive. She reached for Ryan's hand and squeezed it, and he squeezed back, understanding without words. William, their youngest, was now 10 years old and showed interests in both ranching and business. He was a bright, curious child who asked endless questions and never seemed satisfied with simple answers. Grace suspected he would do something unexpected with his life, something neither ranching nor sewing, and she looked forward to seeing what he chose. As Grace entered her late 40s, she began to think about the future of the dress shop. Rose had moved with her husband to Eagle Pass where Peter taught at the school, and though she still helped with special orders, she was busy with her own life. Grace needed to decide whether to train new seamstresses, to pass on her skills and knowledge to another generation, or to gradually scale back her work. The decision was made for her in the spring of 1909. A 15-year-old girl named Molly Brown came to the shop asking for work. She was an orphan, she explained, raised by an elderly aunt who had just passed away. She needed to support herself and had some basic sewing skills. There was something in her eyes, a combination of determination and vulnerability that reminded Grace powerfully of herself at that age. "Can you show me your stitching?" Grace asked, and Molly pulled out a small piece of embroidery she had worked. It was rough but showed promise. Grace hired her on the spot and began teaching her everything she knew. Molly proved to be a quick learner, hungry for knowledge and willing to work hard. She moved into a small room in the back of the shop, and within a year, she was handling many of the simpler orders herself. One afternoon, as they worked together on a particularly complex wedding dress, Molly asked, "Why did you take a chance on me?" I was nobody, with no real skills and no references. Grace paused in her stitching, thinking back to a day over 25 years ago when she had stood at her grandmother's grave, feeling lost and alone. She thought about Ryan appearing in her life at exactly the moment she needed someone. She thought about all the ways people had shown her kindness and given her chances. "Because someone once took a chance on me," Grace said simply. "Because I know what it feels like to need an opportunity. And because I saw something in you, a spark of determination, that reminded me of myself." In 1911, when Grace was 49 and Ryan was 53, they celebrated their 28th wedding anniversary. Their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a party. Henry and Katherine now had 3 children of their own. Rose and Peter had 2. William, at 13, was already taller than his father and showing signs of being the tallest of the Xavier men. That evening, after the party had ended and the house was quiet, Grace and Ryan sat on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. Ryan had more gray in his hair now, and the lines around his eyes had deepened. Grace knew she showed the marks of age too, her hands more weathered from years of sewing, her face carrying the evidence of decades of laughter and tears. But when Ryan looked at her, his eyes still held the same love, the same wonder, as they had on their wedding day. 28 years, he said softly. "Sometimes it feels like no time at all, and sometimes it feels like you have always been part of my life." "I cannot imagine my life without you," Grace said. "Everything good I have, everything I am has been shaped by loving you and being loved by you." Ryan reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "Do you remember what I said about your wedding dress? About how it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen?" "Of course I remember." "I was wrong," Ryan said. "Or not wrong exactly, but incomplete. The dress was beautiful, but it was just a symbol. The real beauty was you, Grace. The strength it took to take something broken and make it whole again. The courage to wear your wounds openly instead of hiding them. The faith to believe that something damaged could still be precious. That is what I saw in you that day, and that is what I have watched you live out every day since. You are the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." Grace felt tears slip down her cheeks, and she did not bother to wipe them away. After almost 3 decades of marriage, after all they had been through together, Ryan could still move her to tears with his words. They sat there in the darkness, holding hands and watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast Texas sky. The same sky that had been above them on their wedding day, on the day their children were born, on good days and hard days and all the ordinary days in between. As the years continued to pass, Grace and Ryan gradually stepped back from their active roles in the dress shop and ranch. Henry fully took over ranch operations, proving to be even better at it than Ryan had been. Molly essentially ran the dress shop, with Grace coming in to help with special orders and to provide guidance. Grace and Ryan spent their time with their grandchildren, teaching them the things their own parents had taught them. Grace showed the girls how to sew, though she was careful not to push it on those who showed no interest. Ryan took the boys and the girls out on horseback, teaching them about the land and the animals and the cycles of nature. In 1915, William left for college, the first in the family to pursue higher education. He wanted to study business and hoped to someday help ranchers and small businesses better manage their finances. Grace and Ryan were proud, even though they missed him terribly. The world was changing rapidly. Automobiles were becoming common, replacing horses and wagons. The war in Europe was in the news constantly, though it still felt distant from their corner of Texas. Fashions were changing, hemlines rising, corsets being abandoned. Grace adapted her dress designs to keep up with the times, even as she maintained the quality and attention to detail that had always been her hallmark. In 1918, when the influenza pandemic swept through the country, Eagle Pass was not spared. Grace and Ryan, now in their 50s, were fortunate to experience only mild cases. But they lost friends and neighbors, including Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house where Grace had worked so long ago. Each loss was a reminder of the preciousness of life, of the importance of treasuring the time they had. As Grace entered her 60s, she found herself thinking more and more about legacy. What would remain after she was gone? What had her life meant? She had the dress shop, which would continue under Molly's capable management. She had her children and grandchildren, carrying on the values she and Ryan had instilled. She had the hundreds of brides whose wedding days she had helped make special. But there was something else, something more intangible but equally important. She had taken the pain of loss and transformed it into something beautiful. She had honored her grandmother's memory not by dwelling in grief, but by living fully, by building a life of love and purpose. She had taken a torn wedding dress and worn it proudly, and in doing so had shown that damage does not diminish value, that what is broken can be made whole again. In 1925, Grace and Ryan celebrated their 42nd wedding anniversary. The party was large, attended by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, by friends and former customers and ranch hands. Grace looked around at all the faces, at all the lives that had been touched by the love she and Ryan shared, and felt a deep sense of gratitude. As the sun set that evening, Grace slipped away to the old house she and Ryan had first lived in as newlyweds, the house that was now used for storage. She found the trunk that held her grandmother's wedding dress, the dress she had worn to marry Ryan. She carefully unwrapped it, holding it up to the fading light. The ivory satin had yellowed further with age. The repairs she had made over 4 decades ago showed the effects of time. But it was still beautiful, still precious, still a symbol of everything she believed about love and resilience. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Ryan in the doorway. He was 70 now, his hair completely white, his movements slower than they once had been. But his eyes still held the same warmth, the same love. "I thought I would find you here," he said softly. "I wanted to see it again," Grace said. "To remember that day, how scared I was but also how full of hope. I had nothing, Ryan, just this torn dress and the courage to wear it, and you looked at me and saw something beautiful." Ryan crossed the small space and pulled her into his arms, the wedding dress held carefully between them. "I saw the most beautiful thing in the world," he said, "and 42 years later, that has not changed." They stood there for a long moment, holding each other and the dress, surrounded by memories and love. Then they carefully folded the dress, wrapped it again in its protective tissue, and placed it back in the trunk. "Our great-granddaughters might want it someday," Grace said. "Another woman might want to wear it, to repair it again, to make it hers while honoring what came before." "I hope so," Ryan said. "I hope this dress gets worn and repaired and worn again for generations. Every time making the woman who wears it feel beautiful, feel connected to something larger than herself." As they walked back to the house where their family waited, Grace thought about the circle of life, about how love persists even through loss, about how beauty can emerge from brokenness. She thought about her grandmother, about the young bride who had worn the dress first, about all the women who had come to her shop, seeking to feel beautiful on the most important days of their lives. And she thought about Ryan, the cowboy who had appeared in her life at her lowest moment and had seen beauty where others might have seen only damage. The man who had loved her faithfully for over 4 decades, who had built a life with her based on respect and partnership and deep abiding affection. "Thank you," she said softly as they walked hand in hand through the gathering darkness. For what? Ryan asked. For seeing me, Grace said. For loving me, for everything. Ryan squeezed her hand. Thank you for letting me, for choosing me, for building this beautiful life with me. They continued walking, neither young anymore, but still strong, still together, still very much in love. Behind them, the house was lit up, full of family and laughter and life. Ahead of them, whatever years remained to be lived fully and gratefully. And in their hearts, the knowledge that they had taken the torn pieces of their early lives and woven them into something beautiful, something that would endure long after they were gone. The dress shop continued to thrive for many more years. Grace worked there occasionally into her 70s, unable to fully retire from something that had been such a central part of her identity. She loved consulting with young brides, sharing her decades of experience, making women feel special on one of the most important days of their lives. Ryan remained active on the ranch until a few years before his death, always finding some task that needed doing, always needing to check on the cattle or the horses or the land. He could not imagine a life of complete leisure, and Grace never tried to make him. She understood that the ranch was part of who he was, just as sewing was part of her. Their children and grandchildren visited often, sometimes staying for weeks at a time. The ranch house was always full of laughter and activity during those visits. Grace would cook large meals, and Ryan would take the younger ones riding or fishing. These were precious times, and both Grace and Ryan savored every moment. In 1932, when Grace was 70 and Ryan was 72, they made the decision to finally and fully retire. Henry and Katherine took over the house, and Grace and Ryan moved to a small cottage at the edge of the property. It was cozy and manageable, with a garden for Grace and a comfortable porch where Ryan could sit and watch the ranch operations continue without him. Molly had married and had children of her own, and her oldest daughter had joined her in running the dress shop. Grace would visit occasionally, offering advice when asked, but mostly just enjoying seeing her life's work continue and flourish under younger hands. Grace and Ryan spent their final years in simple contentment. They would sit on their porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the land they had worked so hard to build a life on. They would talk about the past, remembering the early struggles and the hard-won victories. They would talk about their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, marveling at how their family had grown from just the two of them. Ryan passed away peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1935, at the age of 75. He had lived a full life, worked hard, loved deeply, and left behind a legacy of integrity and kindness. Grace mourned him deeply but not despairingly. They had been blessed with over 50 years together, decades of love and partnership and companionship. She knew how rare and precious that was. Grace lived 3 more years, surrounded by family, still sharp and engaged with the world around her. She died quietly on a warm summer evening in 1938 at the age of 76. Her last words were to Rose, who was holding her hand. "It was all beautiful," Grace whispered. "Every bit of it. Even the hard parts, especially the hard parts, that is where the real beauty was." They buried her beside Ryan in the family cemetery on the hill overlooking the ranch. At her request, she was buried in her grandmother's wedding dress, the torn and repaired gown that had symbolized so much in her life. It seemed fitting that the dress that had begun its journey on one bride and continued on another would end its journey accompanying Grace on her final voyage. The dress shop continued for another 2 generations, always maintaining the standards of quality and care that Grace had established. The ranch flourished under Henry's management and later under his children's. William became a successful business consultant, helping small businesses and ranches throughout Texas. Rose's children inherited her artistic talent, several becoming artists and designers, but perhaps the most enduring legacy was the story itself. The story of a grieving young woman and a kind cowboy, of a torn wedding dress, and the man who saw beauty in the damage. The story of how love can heal, how partnership can build something greater than either person could create alone, how what is broken can become even more beautiful when repaired with care and patience and love. The story was passed down through generations, told to children and grandchildren, shared at family gatherings. It became part of the family's identity, a reminder of where they came from and the values that had built their family. It became a touchstone, something to remember when times were hard or when they doubted themselves. In the house that had been Grace and Ryan's, the one that Henry and Katherine had raised their family in, and that was now home to yet another generation, there was a photograph on the mantel. It showed a young woman in an ivory satin wedding dress, standing beside a tall cowboy. The dress showed signs of damage if you looked closely, tears that had been carefully repaired with lace and ribbon. But the woman in the photograph looked radiant, and the cowboy looked at her with such love and pride that it transcended the limits of the old photograph. Beneath the photograph was a small brass plaque that one of the great-grandchildren had made. It read simply, "She wore her grandmother's torn wedding dress. The cowboy said it was the most beautiful thing, and from that truth a family was born." And so the story continued, generation after generation, a testament to the enduring power of love, the beauty that can emerge from brokenness, and the courage it takes to wear your wounds openly and transform them into something precious. Grace and Ryan had started with nothing but hope and hard work and love for each other. They had built a life, a family, a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. Their love story was not extraordinary in its events, but in its depth, its longevity, its steadfastness. It was the kind of love that shows up every day, that works hard, that makes sacrifices, that finds joy in simple things. It was the kind of love that creates families and communities, that makes the world a little bit better, a little bit more beautiful. And it all started with a torn wedding dress, and a cowboy who had the wisdom to see that damage does not diminish beauty, but can, in the hands of someone brave enough to embrace it, enhance it.